He knew the world would not be the same. Few people laughed. Few people cried. Most people were silent. I remembered the line from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. Vishnu is trying to persuade the prince that he should do his duty, and to impress him takes on his multi-armed form and says, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." I suppose we all thought that one way or another.
Greetings, everyone. I have returned with Supervillains Explored, and today I'm going to be taking a look at the first non-Marvel, non-DC character to ever be featured on Supervillains Explored, and that is none other than who I consider to be the quintessential arch-enemy of Spawn, the Redeemer. Now, when it comes to Spawn, there aren't a lot of villains that you can possibly identify. Spawn is a character who's still, in his years, he's still quite young, and there's really not a whole lot of characters that can be completely associated with him, but one of those characters that most people remember and that most people often associate with Spawn is the Redeemer. Now, to give a basic summary, the Redeemer is basically the antithesis of Spawn. The Redeemer is pretty much Heaven's answer to the Hellspawn, which is what gained it the nickname of the Anti-Spawn. And in most other Spawn media, the Redeemer has been featured quite prominently in a lot of video games, and even more so in Todd McFarlane's Spawn action figures. So, to hardcore Spawn fans, the Redeemer is kind of common knowledge. But I figured I should actually get to talking about the character itself. There have been 3 men throughout the Spawn comics who have adopted the mantle of the Redeemer. And for those of you who don't know anything about this character, this is going to be a really awesome little revelation for you. The very first man to become the Redeemer was none other than Jason Wynn. That's right, the same man who is responsible for signing the order to murder Al Simmons and ultimately transform him into Spawn. And it was because of this reason alone that the heavenly forces of purity, who were responsible for creating the Redeemer, decided to choose Jason Wynn to be the first Redeemer. When Jason Wynn went through an accident of nuclear diffusion, his soul was actually summoned all the way up from heaven. And the heavenly order, basically, they searched all the way through his soul, and they saw that Wynn was a very evil man, and he was not pure at all. But they decided to make him into the Redeemer simply due to the fact that he was the man who created Spawn. And thus, they thought that he would carry out his responsibility to destroy Spawn once and for all. So, when they transformed Jason Wynn into the Redeemer, the process of turning a man into a Redeemer is somewhat similar to the process that Al Simmons went through when he became a Hellspawn. Whereas, instead of his body being infused with necroplasm like Spawn, the Redeemer has a different substance coursing through his veins, and that substance is none other than pure heavenly fire. Which, because the heavenly fire burns very intensely throughout Jason Wynn's veins, that means he is in a constant state of pure relentless pain and agony, which gave him even further motivation to completely murder Spawn. So, with Jason Wynn finally turned into the Redeemer, he was unleashed onto the world. And more importantly, he had his sights set on Al Simmons. When Spawn and the Redeemer met for the first time, the fight between the two was extremely brutal, and the Redeemer really ended up beating the crap out of Spawn, and he nearly ended up killing him. In fact, Al Simmons was actually saved by a couple of bums in Rat City that provided a distraction for the Redeemer. And when that happened, Spawn finally had an opening to kill the Redeemer once and for all. So when the Heavenly Forces saw that Jason Wynn had failed in his duties as the Redeemer, they decided to release him of his bondage and send him back to Earth with no memory of his activities as the Redeemer. So they set their sights on a new host. The second man to take up the mantle of the Redeemer was an ex-con named Phil Timper. Originally, Phil Timper was sentenced to 2 years in prison for a Grand Theft Auto, but while he was in prison, he became a very religious man, and in a sense, he'd become completely reformed. So much so that after he was released, when he was released after 2 years, he actually made himself a soup kitchen to give food to the homeless. For all of his good deeds, he was transported to the Angel Station, one of the several outposts that the Heavenly Forces had established around the Earth, and also the locations where human beings were transformed into Redeemers. So when Phil Timper is summoned to an Angel Station, he goes through the process of becoming a Redeemer as well. His body painfully melds with that of the Heavenly Fire. However, unlike Jason Wynn, Phil Timper was not in a state of constant pain and relentless agony. We could all assume that the reason for this is because Phil Timper actually had a pure and decent soul, unlike Jason Wynn, who when he was turned into a Redeemer, he was still a really evil and heartless son of a bitch. The fight between Spawn and the second Redeemer was not exactly a physical one, but more of a battle of cunning and wit. So what Phil Timper did was that he kidnapped one of Spawn's homeless friends, Bobby. He kidnapped Bobby and he took him to the Angel Station. So when at this time, Spawn's was extremely weak, but that was only because his costume was actually going through many changes. And Spawn's costume, which is actually a living creature all on its own, began to evolve, and he turned into a much more powerful and intimidating form. But this was only an elaborate facade, as Spawn was still very weak. So what Spawn did was that he found a nearby angel base, and he kidnapped a female angel and took her hostage. And when this happened, he threatened to kill her in a really slow and painful way. So when that happened, Phil Timper agreed to release Bobby from captivity, and then later on, whenever Phil Timper returns to Earth with Spawn's friend, Spawn betrays the ultimatum, and he quickly defeats and kills Phil Timper. So when that happens, Phil Timper is released from his bondage, and he's put into a hospital, and we never really hear from him again. The final Redeemer was actually a character that Spawn had actually previously known earlier on in the comic series. Eddie Frank was actually a young kid that Spawn had met once, and Spawn tried to help him deal with his highly abusive father by pulling a prank on him. But when Eddie's father figured this out, he began to beat and hurt Eddie a lot worse, and he became even more abusive. So because of this, Eddie Frank ended up murdering his own father. And because of this, he forever held a very big grudge on Spawn. So, during his time in the juvenile institution, Eddie Frank became very religious, and he learned of the Redeemers and how difficult enemies they were for Spawn. So, he actually planned to become one due to his incredibly strong faith in God. So, when he was released from the institution, he went on a murdering spree, and eventually he ended up being mortally wounded and shot. And thus he was taken to the hospital, and his soul was elevated into an angel station where he became a Redeemer. Now, this Redeemer visually stuck out a whole lot more from the other two in the fact that he was the first Redeemer to be given wings, and on top of that, he had a gigantic sword, and he was a lot more heavily armored. So Eddie Frank was way more dangerous than the previous two Redeemers put together. But when Eddie Frank became conscious again in his hospital bed, the demon known as Lord Mammon actually came and visited him, and Mammon actually told Eddie a very startling revelation about his father that ended up completely shaking his faith in God and in heaven. So when that happened, Eddie actually became a good guy for a little while, as he actually accompanied Spawn's mentor, Cagliostro, on an expedition to save to rescue Spawn from hell, because during this point in the comics, Al Simmons was inadvertently thrust back into hell. But at this point, Cagliostro ends up betraying both the Redeemer and Spawn. Only difference is Spawn managed to make his way out of hell, and the Redeemer was stuck in hell, which pretty much rekindled his hatred for Spawn. And thankfully, though, Eddie Frank managed to escape hell with the help of a witch named Nyx. Upon escaping from hell, Eddie Frank managed to track Spawn down, and the two what would follow would be a massive, epic fight between both Spawn and the Redeemer. And despite the difficulty that Spawn went through in this fight, Spawn finally succeeded by grabbing the Redeemer's sword and slicing off his wings. And when this happened, the Redeemer finally died and transformed back into Eddie Frank, who for some reason was teleported back into a hospital bed. They never really explained this, but that's really the last we see of Eddie Frank and pretty much the Redeemers in general. And I have to admit, as a young kid being a massive fan of Spawn, the Redeemer has always been a very frightening character to me. Despite the fact that he is actually an agent of heaven and supposedly a good guy, the Redeemer was a lot more scary to me than Spawn was. I don't know if it was the fact that in the comics the Redeemer was constantly yelling and screaming because of the agony that was ensuing inside of his own body. I mean, come on, if you had searing, painful, hot, fire for blood, you would be screaming and yelling and wailing all the time too. But I also remembered the Redeemer from probably the most vivid memory I have of the Redeemer is actually from the Super Nintendo the Spawn video game for Super Nintendo, where he was actually the final boss. And God, was he a hard boss. That's actually the first exposure I had to the Redeemer. And upon actually reading some more Spawn comics with him, he's always fascinated me, and I've always really considered him to be Spawn's arch nemesis. And I absolutely think that out of all the villains that Spawn has, he really stands out because he's so frightening and he's so powerful. And the fact that he's supposedly an agent for good really makes him a lot more intimidating. Because in the Spawn comics, the way that McFarlane really has it is that they make it appear that the good guys are bad and the bad guys are good, you know. So yeah, I love the Redeemer, and if McFarlane and his company ever decide to get off their ass and do like a reboot of Spawn, this is the guy I want to see as the main villain because he's awesome. All right, see you all later.